Well, the public policy for emissions on farm right now actually are more centered on nitrous oxide emissions rather than pure CO2 emissions. And let me give you a little bit of background on this. It's because, well, there's two major greenhouse gases that are emitted from food production on fields. And one can be carbon dioxide, and that's when we lose soil organic matter. If we gain soil organic matter, then that's a uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The second is nitrous oxide, and it gets a little complicated in terms of the ways nitrous oxide can be introduced to the atmosphere. The easiest to understand and probably the largest component is emissions of nitrous oxide that are generated from soil biology when nitrogen fertilizers are added and transformed in soil, and some N2O will be released. So in terms of policy now, Canada has a target. It's a federal government target. It's a voluntary target. And that is for achieving a 30% reduction in nitrous oxide emissions by 2030 of 2020 levels. Okay. That's a voluntary target. It's not mandatory. It's not regulatory. But if we were to talk about a policy, that is definitely a policy that the government is saying, hey, all sectors will be contributing to a reduction in greenhouse gases. For agriculture, that is our current focus, is to reduce that portion of emissions. Okay. There is it's a bit of debate about that in terms of what is achievable. And if we just look based on the science and practice in terms of what farmers can do and what we know they can do to reduce N2O emissions, it's pretty clear that 30% is achievable. Okay. It's pretty clear. However, the issue now becomes in the application. And how do we get there? That is where there's quite a bit of debate. And that means that the reason why is that we need much greater adoption of practices that reduce emissions. And so that's where we start getting to the point of, can we achieve it or not? And it's going to be dependent on the adoption by the growers. And so depending where you are on that, are you a believer that, yes, the growers can adopt the practices? And we're talking wide scale adoption across Canada by growers. Or if you say, well, there's economic constraints, these practices cost money to growers. There is a learning constraint in terms of there needs to be new training, and growers will need to become comfortable with slightly different approaches to utilization of nitrogen fertilizers. So that's where really the issue becomes, is that adoption. And there's barriers to that adoption. And it becomes, well, are we able to overcome those barriers? And there are several different approaches to overcoming barriers, and they will need a mix of those incentives, and it will take investment. It will take determination to do things different, for sure. And I'm an optimist, and I say, I know Canadian growers, and Canadian growers are innovative. They are ever adapting and changing. They are looking for more efficient ways of food production. They're trying to get the most profitability or efficiency and profitability. So based on that and that history, that great phenomenal history of Canadian farmers and their ability to meet challenges and overcome them and be leaders, of the beneficial practices, and we generally frame these within the 4 R's of nutrient management context. Growers are all growers are to some extent using the 4R framework, okay, to shape how they manage nitrogen on fields. Now, you can kind of think of it as using 4Rs in a basic approach to a much more sophisticated approach, okay? So let's say, for example, if you were a farmer that was using nitrogen stabilizers that can reduce N2O emissions for sure. And if you were using or a farmer using variable rate nitrogen based on management zones and landscape positions in a field, like in the prairie potholes or hilly undulating landscapes, that's what I would refer to as more advanced application of the 4Rs, okay? And if you're using soil test and your past history experience with fertilizer rates and the crop and yield targets to set goals and what the expected yield for your field has been in the past and for the region, using the best genetics possible, and doing let's say in the prairies close to one pass operations where you're seeding, fertilizing, and spraying at the same time in the springtime, or your subsurface banding if you're not doing that with planting. Farmers are doing that now. Okay, so what I would say is almost all farmers are applying 4Rs. Okay, it's just to what sophistication that it's been applied at. Okay, so that's the one thing. Okay, so we do have room for improvement or more adoption of those more advanced 4R practices. And I'll give you an example, like nitrogen stabilizers or controlled release fertilizers. Those right now probably make up about 5 to 10% of the market for nitrogen fertilizer. So you can see in terms of the products are very efficient in reducing N2O emissions. And so you can, there's a lot of room for improvement there, right? Like going from 10 to 100%, right? Those products, though, come with a premium cost. And so that's where some will say, well, hang on a second, we can't get to 100 because it's a premium cost. And then what's in it for the farmer, right? How are they going to pay for that premium? Is it yield? Is it carbon market for reducing their greenhouse gas emissions? Is it the fact that they're losing less nitrogen and therefore they can optimize their nitrogen rates by reducing it a little bit to cover the cost of the premium? Or is it a cost sharing program with governments for using those practices? Okay, so we have a lot of room. We have a lot of room on the side of nitrogen stabilizers and controlled release fertilizers, or what we call enhanced efficiency fertilizer practices. We have lots of room on variable rate nitrogen application. We then after those two, it gets a little bit more complicated. Some people will advocate, well, let's not apply fertilizer in the fall and move to the spring. Well, for example, in Manitoba, we're probably around 30% application in the fall of our nitrogen fertilizer. Well, there's reasons why farmers do that in the fall. Good reasons that they do that in the fall. So it doesn't make sense that we'd go to 100% spring application in Manitoba, because we're going against some really sensible reasons that farmers have for doing fall application, right? And when we're talking about things such as subsurface placement of soil on the prairies, where banding is the the status or status quo. I don't like status quo, which is the common approach, right? And then we have high adoption, really high adoption. Okay, we're probably 70-80%. We do have values on this, by the way, in terms of the National Fertilizer Use Survey. And so some practices where we're doing really exceptionally well, others there's room for increasing them. Probably going to be the farmers that are larger scale is one thing that strikes me, right? The more acres you have, in that you can apply to these programs or to a market, a carbon market, you just have that economy of size, right? More acres, you get more return, right? So, one of the things that I always think of is the amount of work it takes to participate for the farmer in these programs, be it on the carbon market or with these cost sharing programs. There's paperwork involved, and there's a few hoops, right? There needs to be a tracking by the organization that's rolling out the program, and therefore that requires work, right? Paperwork. You need a trail to legitimize what the payout is for, right? So that takes time for the grower, and some of these programs, cost sharing programs, require even a professional, a CCA or professional agrologist, somebody that's accredited to help out with the paperwork. There's costs involved with that. So I always think about it as well. If I'm a larger grower, then it's more my worthwhile to invest in that and to go there, right? So I'll give you an example with the off-calf program in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. A farmer can, over 2 years of the program, they can get a maximum of $75,000 in terms of retrieval of expenses under quite a few different BMPs that they can do for the first time on fields. And I think that 75,000 covers up to 85% of the expense, right? So it's not full cost recovery, but it's pretty good. But if you're a small grower, chances are you're not going to be able to reach the $75,000 over the 2 years if you're quite small. So it just and therefore it's going to just the time you put in and even the cost for assistance to put the paperwork in is it's just in effect less return, right? A little bit lower rate of return than the large grower. Well, there can be a lot of things that can be done. Now, are they practical, and are they effective, and are they cost? Is there a good cost benefit to them? I'll give you one example. A lot of farmers are not so happy on the fact that they have increased the diversity of their cropping systems. In other words, they've reduced summer fallow. They're including pulses and trying new crops. And so they're trying to grow crops every year, right? Unless we have quite issues with the weather. And then also they're doing direct seeding. And the direct seeding, in combination with growing crops every year, has resulted in an increase in carbon in soil. In other words, we've increased soil organic carbon levels. Now that started in the 1980s, mid to late 1980s, really picked up steam in the 90s, and started to really mature and level off then by the end of what I guess now 2 decades ago. And so a lot of farmers are saying, whoa, I invested in all this machinery and I'm doing such a good thing for my land. and reduction of emissions. I'm using less fuel. I'm building carbon. Why can't I get recognized for that? Okay. So, the conundrum is that usually with these programs, you have a reference point. The reference point in this case is 2020. And, the farmers need to do something new on that parcel of land. If they're doing something like direct seeding and cropping every year, they've been doing that for 15, 20 years more, then it's perceived as that's their cropping system. It's nothing new, right? But they're still building carbon every year. There's a bit of debate. Is it as much as initially when they implemented the system? But I could probably say they're still building some carbon. So they would like to get acknowledged for that and have some reward for that. I think there could be leeway for the government to say, okay, well, let's think about this. In some ways, you're alienating the early adopters, you're alienating the most innovative growers. And then at the same time, then you want to capture that same group of farmers and say, hey, well, we got these new practices, we got these advanced 4R practices that can reduce N2O emissions, right? Join us in reducing emissions. And then, a lot of the times they'll say, well, hang on a second here. Well, I adopted this years ago on my own, and you're not recognizing it as being good, this and that. It just leaves not quite leads to a good relationship, okay, in terms of the grower saying, yeah, okay, yeah, let me think about this in terms of adopting these new practices. So I would, and I got to be careful here because I'm a public servant, and I'm not a government employee or so I have to be careful with this. But I think farmers would appreciate if they had some reward for what they've already initiated. So I would think it'd be great if the government could think about maybe, and it's not give some reward, okay, and maybe it's not 100% of. Well, they may not even have costs anymore, but to say, okay, if you've done no-till for, you already started no-till, direct seeding and cropping every year, then we'll provide so much, even if it's a token amount. It just tells the grower, we recognize what you've done, and we think about continuing to be innovative, right? Well, right now, we're really taking a simple approach. Okay, I know farmers probably don't think it's that simple, and maybe some provincial governments don't think it's that simple, but we're looking at reduction of N2O emissions from the use of fertilizer, which has been the target reduction, this voluntary target reduction. There are other sources of N2O, such as ammonia losses and nitrate leaching. Now, those losses of nitrogen from leaching and from ammonia, from a farmer's perspective, have more impact to them agronomically, because those are many pounds of nitrogen per acre being lost. Okay, like tens, potentially, in some, depending on where you are in the soils of Canada. And whereas N2O direct emissions only amounts to a few pounds of nitrogen. So from a farmer's perspective, right now we're targeting this N2O directly from fertilizers being transformed by biology and soil. But from a farmer's perspective, there's agronomic incentive for reducing those emissions is not great, but it's just a few pounds. Whereas if we also start rolling out programs looking at ammonia loss reduction and nitrate leaching loss reductions, now all of a sudden we're starting to talk farmer language here. And we're talking about tens of pounds of nitrogen being saved from being lost. And if you push a pencil, depending on the price of nitrogen per pound, that and a sizable farm, that's a lot of money to be saved. And it's good for the environment because they are sources of N2O. We call them indirect sources of N2O. So this is why I'm very optimistic, because we haven't even started thinking about those N2O reductions that really have important agronomic implications in relation to a farmer. And once we start talking about ammonia loss and nitrate loss, you're going to see the farmers start to listen. Okay, because that's where their profits and efficiency is really going to start to change.